A Hells Angels biker bought a rundown warehouse in Butte for so cheap that everyone laughed and told him he was crazy. The locals shook their heads, whispering that no sane person would throw money at a pile of scrap metal about to collapse. But when Jake Bear Lawson pushed open the rotting wooden door and stepped into the stifling darkness inside, he had no idea that moment would change the course of his fate and awaken a legacy buried for more than half a century. Jake Bear Lawson had never believed his life would take a peaceful turn, not until the day he quietly left California, carrying the ashes of his past and the unhealed pain from the death of his closest brother in the club. He left the Hells Angels not because he'd fallen out of love with that life, but because that loss made him realize sometimes a man needs to step back to find his own breath again. Yet beneath the sun-faded leather jacket and weathered tattoos still beat the heart of a biker who lived for loyalty, for brotherhood, for the right things society never bothered to see. Jake's childhood hadn't been bright. He grew up in Boise, Idaho, in a cramped house where his mother worked 3 jobs to keep him fed and in school, while the neighbors treated him like a burden on society. No one saw that the kid just needed one chance. They only saw the defiant eyes and the fist that came up fast when he was cornered. Jake was labeled a troublemaker long before he even understood what life was. It wasn't until he stumbled across his Hells Angels brothers on the road that he finally found a real family, one that looked at courage, loyalty, and heart instead of his rough exterior. Leaving the club didn't mean leaving who he was. So when his Harley carried Jake to Butte, Montana, a cold, tiny town where locals froze the moment a strange biker rolled through, he didn't pay it much mind. They looked at him like a threat. But Jake was used to being misunderstood. He just wanted a place to shelter his soul. One morning, while stopping at a little roadside cafe, Jake spotted a for-sale notice for an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The price was so low that the people nearby burst out laughing, saying only a madman, a drunk or an outsider would touch that rotting heap. But Jake didn't laugh, because in that crumpled piece of paper he saw the promise he'd sworn to keep. The promise to his fallen brother from that fatal night on the highway, to open a workshop that fixed bikes for free for veterans and taught trades to kids society had forgotten, kids just like he'd been. If he had to start from a pile of ruins, he would. Decay never scared Jake. It was just the starting point for something that could be beautiful. That afternoon, Jake signed the papers for the barn under the skeptical stares of the clerk and a few locals standing nearby, but he didn't care. When his Harley pulled up to the deserted lot, where weeds grew waist-high and the barn leaned crookedly alone under Montana's huge sky, Jake killed the engine, took off his helmet, and just looked. The cold wind blew through the rotting boards, making sounds like forgotten sighs. Jake pushed open the barn's rotting door and stepped inside, his breath catching the moment his eyes adjusted to the patchy darkness ahead. Thin light slipped through holes in the roof, cutting slanted beams like knives through thick dust, turning everything into a hazy glow like a world abandoned long ago. The smell of damp mold hit him hard, mixed with rusted metal and rotting wood, like the breath of an old beast that had slept too long under time's ashes. The inside was no better than the outside. Cracked wallboards swollen from old floods, junk scattered across the floor, a broken cabinet door, a length of chain-stained rust-red, bare wooden frames reduced to rough skeletons. The dirt and rotting wood floor was worn into strange ridges, as if something heavy had been dragged across it hundreds of times. When Jake took another step, the echo wasn't just from his boot on dry plank. It sounded like someone else was walking with him, half a beat behind. For a man who'd ridden empty roads at midnight, poked through abandoned car graveyards, and traveled highways with only wind and engine noise for company, Jake wasn't easily spooked. But here in this cold, sweet, stale air thick with time, he felt something different. Not danger, not a threat. Just an ancient, heavy, sorrowful presence, like someone's memories still clung to every beam, every crack in the wall, every forgotten object lying on the ground. Jake touched a dark wooden post. The rough, cold surface made him shiver slightly. Someone had stood right here, worked here, lived their whole life in this barn. That feeling hovered around him like the breath of memory. As Jake moved deeper, he heard traffic from the road outside. Through the half-open door he saw locals passing by, staring in. A middle-aged woman pulled her son close, as if Jake might charge out any second. An old man in a baseball cap stood with arms crossed, eyes locked suspiciously on Jake's Harley. Worse, some young guys farther off held up phones, snapping pictures, laughing and saying something to each other, probably adding illustrations to the story of the crazy biker who bought the rotten barn. Jake was used to it. Those looks didn't bother him as much anymore, but sometimes the repetition still weighed on his heart. He turned back inside, where the cold dimness was slowly swallowing the last of the afternoon light. The sun was fading, and the barn instantly changed. The chill didn't come from the wind. It came from inside the structure itself, as if the old building was lowering its voice, watching him, weighing who he was, and why he dared enter a place that once belonged to someone else. Wind whistling through wall cracks made long, low sounds almost like breathing. Jake stood in the middle of the huge empty space, his boots leaving fresh dust prints on the old floor, and he realized the feeling from earlier, the sense of being watched, judged, evaluated, wasn't from the people outside. It came from the barn itself. There was something more than decay here, something hidden, preserved, or sealed away. He wasn't sure yet, but his gut told him this place once held something important, something big enough to make the air feel this heavy. When Jake touched the barn door again to step outside, it felt like the building just sighed, not to drive him away, but to challenge him, waiting to see if he was worthy of knowing what lay deep inside it. In the days that followed, Jake treated cleaning up the abandoned barn like the only thing keeping him sane and breathing after years of loss. He woke before sunrise, stepped onto the dew-soaked ground, old scythe in hand borrowed from a farmer over the hill. Waist-high weeds wrapped around his legs like they were trying to hold him back, but Jake swung the blade hard, each cut slicing the air with finality. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with damp earth created a strange scent that was both exhausting and peaceful. Every time the weeds fell, he felt like he was cutting away pieces of his own buried memories, highways stained with ambulance sirens, long nights holding grief too big to breathe through. Jake dragged out rusted frames and time-stained machine parts from the chaos. Some looked worthless, but he didn't toss them. Those things might have once been part of something important, just like people society left behind who still carried value no one bothered to see. By noon, when sunlight poured through roof holes, Jake climbed up to patch them with cheap boards. Every nail he hammered echoed through the empty space, like waking some old heartbeat beneath layers of dust. Even though the repairs were rough, to Jake every task felt like bringing the barn back to life, and bringing himself back too. That afternoon, as the last rays of daylight fell across the rocky floor, Jake decided to clean the deepest corner of the barn. From the very first time he'd stepped inside, that corner had made the hairs on his neck rise, not from fear, but because it carried a different kind of silence, heavier and deeper. Light never reached the center no matter how it shone. It only skimmed the edges. Jake crouched down and started pulling out water-rotted wooden crates softened by time. Cardboard boxes gnawed by mice spilled out foam turned to powder. When he cleared the junk off the floorboards, Jake noticed something wrong. The planks here weren't laid naturally like the rest of the floor. They were overlapped on purpose, deliberately misaligned. Someone had placed them that way. Jake brushed away thick dust with his palm, then tapped lightly with his knuckles. The sound made him freeze. Hollow, hollow. Not the solid thud of wood or dirt, but an empty echo dropping downward like there was a void underneath. He tapped the next plank, same sound. The instinct of a biker who'd worked in countless old shops, warehouses, and forgotten storage spots told him something very different lay beneath these boards. Jake yanked up a few more planks. They came loose easier than expected, as if they'd only been placed to hide something no one was meant to see. When light from the broken roof shone down, he clearly saw the sharp square outline of a trapdoor in the floor. Thick iron hinges on one edge were rusted but sturdy, proof the previous owner wanted this door to last. The lock in the center was heavy, old-fashioned iron, built solid, not like ordinary farm locks. This was a lock meant to keep a secret, not to keep out animals. Jake reached out and touched it. A chill shot up his spine. The metal was unnaturally cold even though the air around him was warm. It made him feel like no one had touched this lock in years. He looked down at the trap door, dust so thick that the slightest touch sent clouds swirling. Suddenly the barn went dead silent. Even the wind through the cracks seemed to pause. Jake stood motionless for a few seconds, clearly feeling something below waiting, not threatening him, but more like an ancient memory trying to speak. A sharp primal instinct rose up. Whatever's down there has been waiting a long time, and it just recognized me. Jake took a deep breath, staring at the trapdoor the way he used to stare down rivals back in his riding days. But this time he wasn't afraid. That night, back in his small cabin on the edge of Butte, Jake sat on the old wooden chair, hands still feeling the cold from the mysterious lock under the barn floor. The Montana sky was so clear he could see the Milky Way stretched across it, but inside Jake everything felt thick as storm clouds. He tried to sleep, but the image of the trapdoor, the strange hollow knocks, and the sensation that something under the ground was watching him kept his mind racing. Every time he shifted on the thin mattress, his brain replayed touching the ice-cold lock, every detail, every feeling from that moment. Jake had slept in far worse conditions. Cramped parking lots, lousy motels, shop benches, even open ground beside the highway on long club runs. But tonight nothing could block the barn echoing in his head. He heard sounds that shouldn't exist in an abandoned place. Distant engine revs, the steady metallic heartbeat of an old chopper, sometimes tires crunching on gravel like someone circling the barn itself. When he opened his eyes, everything vanished. The cabin silent again, only wind whistling through the window. But the moment he closed them, the sounds returned clearer, men laughing in warm, low voices, bottles clinking, heavy boots on wooden floors. Jake rolled over, opened his eyes, closed them again, and the dream hit instantly. He was standing in the barn, but not the ruined one. A lively shop, neon lights glowing red and blue off disassembled bikes, tattooed men focused on engines, laughter filling the air. The smell of gasoline was so real he could almost taste it. A long-haired man with silver-streaked hair turned, smiled kindly, but his eyes were so deep they startled Jake. In that instant, Jake was sure the man wanted to say something, but the dream snapped away as he bolted upright, cold sweat running down his back. He looked around, the cabin dark, quiet, but his heart pounded like war drums. Jake had never been one for mystical stuff. Biker life taught him to trust reality, engines, brothers, and the road ahead. But these dreams felt too real, more like someone else's memories than imagination, as if the barn was passing its own story to him. He got up, went to the sink, splashed water on his face, and stared at himself in the mirror. Dark circles under his eyes, scruffy beard, but deep inside a spark he hadn't seen in years, the hunger to find out. He knew this feeling. Biker instinct, the thing that had saved his life countless times on the road, was speaking. It didn't shout or push, it quietly pulled him toward the trapdoor like a magnet pulls iron. In the biker world, instinct was sometimes more reliable than rules. It reminded him of times Bowen heard a faint sound and knew the bike behind them had trouble, or when the whole club avoided a crash because someone felt something off. Instinct had never lied to him. And now it told him that trapdoor wasn't ordinary. It hid something bigger than the barn, bigger than whoever once lived there. He went back to bed but didn't lie down. Instead he sat up, hands clasped, thoughts racing. What if it's a legacy from an old school biker? What if it's a secret workshop? What if there's a story someone tried to keep hidden? Those thoughts didn't scare him. They made him feel alive again. To Jake, legacy was never about money. It was what a person left behind so the next generation would know who they were. Bowen had left him an unfinished promise, and in the dream, the silver-haired man, no way that was random. Maybe it was the old owner's memory, looking for someone to carry it on. Maybe it was a sign he'd been chosen. It all looped in his head like an engine that wouldn't shut off. By the time the sky outside the cabin turned dawn gray, Jake knew he couldn't walk away from that trapdoor, not out of curiosity, but because he felt an invisible thread connecting him to whatever lay beneath the wood. Something was calling him, not urgent, not loud, but steady. The same way long roads always call a biker to ride. Jake stood, opened his closet, pulled out an old tool bag, hammer, crowbar, bolt cutters, a few pry bars. They'd traveled with him on countless trips and saved him from trouble more than once. He packed them into his backpack, checked everything again, then zipped it shut with familiar decisiveness. Stepping outside, the early frost bit at his jacket, but inside Jake burned like a freshly lit fire. He put on his helmet, straddled the Harley, and fired it up. The crisp engine roar cut through the mist, like the approving growl of a long-lost brother. Jake gripped the bars tight, looked down the road to the barn, and knew today was the day he'd open that trap door. A new journey was waiting, and this time, he wasn't running away. He was riding straight toward it. Jake rode through the early morning fog, tires grinding over wet dirt still holding the chill from the night before. And as the barn emerged in the pale dawn light, he felt like it was standing there waiting for him, silent yet brimming with life. The rising sun had only just touched the edge of the rusted tin roof, casting a thin blade of light that sliced across the surface of time. Jake killed the engine and propped the bike up, and the moment the motor went quiet, a strange silence swallowed everything. No birds, no wind, just the barn breathing softly, as if it knew today he would touch its deepest secret. He stepped inside, boots creaking lightly on the rotted wooden floor, faint shafts of light dropping through holes in the roof like guiding beams. He stopped at the corner where days earlier he'd spotted the trap door, the warped boards, a thin layer of dust that couldn't hide the sharp outlines beneath. Cold from the palm-sized padlock seeped into his fingers when he touched it, sending a shiver up his spine, not fear, but the feeling he was about to open a legacy someone had fought like hell to keep sealed. He pulled the bolt cutters from his pack, set the jaws around the rusted shackle, and drew a long breath. When he squeezed, the metal groaned in protest, the sound compressed in the hollow space like the final moan of a gatekeeper who'd guarded the secret too long. He squeezed harder. Then, crack. The snap was so loud dust rained down from the rafters like gray snow. It sounded like the sigh of a soul that had stood watch for decades and was finally set free. Jake stood still for a few seconds, feeling an invisible tremor ripple through the air. The barn was no longer silent. It woke up. He pulled the broken lock free, set it aside, slipped his fingers into the gap between the boards, and lifted the trap door. Dust exploded into the light, and below yawned a darkness deep as the mouth of some giant beast. But as his eyes adjusted, Jake saw old stone steps hidden in the shadows, built carefully, evenly, not the work of chance, but of someone who had poured real effort into them. A cold breath of air hit his face, carrying the smell of earth, metal, and time locked away far too long. He didn't feel like he was standing at a basement entrance, but at a passage leading down into someone's memories, or maybe an entire era's. Jake clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting downward, striking the damp stone and throwing off sparks of light like sweat on skin. He stood there gripping the edge of the door, and for the first time in years he felt two opposing emotions at once. Real fear. The fear of the unknown, of a darkness that could swallow him without warning, and a warm, almost familiar feeling, as if those stone steps had known his name for years and were inviting him home. In the Hells Angels world, they say a biker doesn't run from the dark, he rides straight through it. Jake took a deep breath, let the trap door fall open, and stepped onto the first stair. The sound of his boot on stone echoed like a heartbeat inside the barn's chest. 1, he counted. 2. With every step the darkness grew thicker, but he didn't turn back. He'd faced death on the highway, watched brothers fall right in front of him. Nothing down here could shake him like those memories, but this was different. It didn't threaten him. It watched him, as if making sure he was the right man. Halfway down, a faint breeze from nowhere gusted upward, making the flashlight flicker. He froze, heart skipping a beat. He could almost hear faint whispers, like a motor idling in a winter night, like distant voices talking. He closed his eyes for a second. Getting carried away, he told himself. But he had to admit something down here had been around longer than him, longer than the barn's last owner, maybe longer than the barn itself. And now it had woken up. Jake opened his eyes, took the last steps, and swept the flashlight across the smooth stone floor of the room below. His boots touched cold ground. The space was so quiet he could hear his own breathing bounce back at him. He glanced up. The circle of light from the trap door glowed far above like a distant sun guiding a traveler. The sight made him feel he'd just stepped through a door in time. There was no going back the way he came. He swept the light in a quick circle, not yet exploring deep but enough to see the shadows in the corners shift slightly with the beam. Again he heard a faint metallic clink, tiny far away, echoing from the end of a long tunnel. Jake knew there was no retreat. Breaking that lock this morning hadn't just opened a physical path, it had unleashed a current of the past demanding to be named. And for reasons he didn't understand, he was the one chosen to walk into it. Jake drew a deep breath, tightened his grip on the flashlight, and whispered to the darkness ahead. "All right, let's see what's down here calling me." The moment the words left his mouth, the beam caught something that stopped him dead, a silver glint running along something long and curved like the spine of a chopper frame. Jake took a few more steps, heart pounding as the light widened, revealing a space he couldn't believe existed beneath the rotten floor of an abandoned barn. Before him stretched a massive workshop, not the chaotic mess of an amateur, but the lair of a man who had lived his whole life for machines and poured his soul into every corner. Old frames leaned against each other like tired warriors resting after battle. Some were rusted through, others still held the graceful curves of hand-forged metal more than half a century old. Jake moved closer, knees almost buckling, and ran his hand over cold steel. Beneath decades of dust he could still feel the strength, the perfect balance, something only the most skilled hands could create. He spoke softly, afraid to disturb the dead. This wasn't built by any ordinary wrench. Beside the frame stood long benches made of hard wood, roughened and cracked by time but still standing like old soldiers guarding secrets. On them, tools lay in almost sacred order: wrenches, hammers, pliers, radius gauges, specialty rulers, scraps of metal marked with symbols only true builders understand. Nothing thrown around, everything placed with the logic any biker would recognize at a glance. The master was an artist. Goosebumps rose on Jake's neck, not from fear but from reverence. He was standing in the sanctuary of a legend. When the light swept the wall, he saw faded posters taped to stone, early choppers tearing across Nevada, long-bearded bikers with knife-sharp eyes. The ink had bled, but the soul of each image still burned in the flickering beam. He moved deeper. The air down here smelled of old oil, metal, rubber, the scents any biker calls home. But what stopped him cold was a section of wall hidden under thick dust. For reasons he couldn't explain, Jake reached out and wiped it clean. As the dust fell away in gray flakes, words appeared, carved deep and proud. Redwood Jack, 1968. For several seconds Jake stood frozen. His heart felt gently squeezed, not pain, but a pressure that stole his breath. He read it again and again, unable to believe his eyes. Redwood Jack. That name wasn't just legend. To the old-school writers, Redwood Jack was a monument, a builder who turned raw metal into machines, considered the very soul of America. He'd run with different chapters, transformed crude frames into beasts that crossed deserts, snow, war, and time itself. No one knew exactly when he vanished. Only rumors he left California, headed north with his final unfinished bike, looking for a quiet place to live out his days. Some old-timers said, if the right man ever comes along, Jack will leave his legacy behind. Jake had never believed those stories, until now. He touched the carved letters, fingertips tracing every cut. It wasn't just a name, it was the mark of a soul that had once lived down here, hammering metal with his heart. Jake exhaled hard, stepped back. Holy shit, he whispered. I'm standing in Redwood Jack's shop. The thought sent fire through his veins like pure biker blood, rushing back to life. If this was where Jack worked, then everything here wasn't junk. It was priceless heritage, not for money, but for what it meant to the brotherhood. He kept moving, the flashlight trembling with his pulse. He found more things that choked him up. A hand-stitched seat left unfinished, every stitch placed by loving fingers. A small notebook with edges rotted by time. Pages filled with professional chopper sketches. A row of exhaust pipes bent in styles no one bothered with anymore. Too hard, too much work. Jake swallowed hard. He felt like he was reading the history of the world he belonged to, not in words, but in steel, in the roar of engines, in men who lived their whole lives for the machines they loved. Then the beam stopped in a dark corner. A bike. Incomplete, but clearly Jack's final masterpiece. Frame up, rear wheel mounted, fuel lines run temporarily, engine waiting on the floor, as if the builder meant to come back and finish it, then disappeared. Jake stepped closer, handshaking. He laid his palm on the frame. It was cold, but not lifeless. It seemed to thrum under his touch, or maybe he imagined it, but he knew he was touching more than metal. This was the last piece of Redwood Jack's soul, and somehow it was asking him to finish it. One question rose in his mind. Why me? But before he could answer, the question no longer mattered. What mattered was that he was here, right now. Like fate had dragged him to Montana, to this barn, to this trapdoor, so he could stand here at this exact moment. He drew a deep breath, looked out over the vast shop, the frames, the tools, the traces of one man's life. Redwood Jack. Jake said into the darkness, voice low and sincere, I don't know what you want from me, but I won't let this place die again. In the dead silence, his promise echoed, not just as sound, but like acceptance from an old builder long gone. And Jake knew, from this moment forward, his life had changed. Not just because he'd found a legend's workshop, but because he'd found a part of himself he thought was buried with the brothers he'd lost. He stood in the dark, but inside he burned brighter than ever. A biker doesn't choose the road chooses him. And Redwood Jack's shop had just chosen Jake Lawson. The stillness of the workshop swallowed Jake's vow the instant it left his lips, and as he stood there with the flashlight trembling in his hand, he realized one crucial thing: this was only the surface of the legacy Redwood Jack had left behind. The very breath of the cellar seemed to change, growing warmer, deeper, as if the place had accepted him into its past. Jake turned the light toward the darkest corners, places time seemed to have buried, but that were really just waiting for the right hands. He began exploring every nook, every shelf, every stack of wooden crates, and the deeper he looked, the clearer it became. Jack wasn't just a wrench, wasn't just a biker. He was the keeper of an entire era's soul. On a shelf to the left, Jake found a bundle of old papers tied with rawhide. He carefully loosened the cord and froze when he saw what was inside. These weren't ordinary chopper sketches. They were never-released designs, shapes that modern builders still called mythical. The lines flowed like they'd been drawn straight from the heart, measurements precise down to the last bolt. Jack had sketched frames the way an artist paints portraits of the dead he loved. Jake's hands shook as he turned the pages. Some carried notes in bold handwriting. Prototype 3, untested. Redo, seat. Customer too short. Idea from a soldier back from the war. Those words caught in Jake's throat. There was real life in them. Not blueprints for machines, but stories of the men inside the metal. Nearby lay yellowed photographs, edges curled from damp, but when Jake lifted them, time rolled back decades. Images of first-generation bikers appeared. Leather, thick beards, half-defiant, half-free smiles, eyes staring straight into the lens like they dared the world to blink. One photo stopped Jake cold. Redwood Jack standing beside a bike he'd built himself, hand on the handlebars, expression gentle yet hard, eyes looking straight through him. Next to him stood a few original Hell's Angels, shirts off, ink covering their backs, faces smeared with grease, but grinning like they were living the best day of their lives. Jake pressed the photo to his chest and breathed deep. "You ran with the mother chapter," he whispered. It felt like past and present were tied together by an invisible rope. He moved on, the beam landing on an old tin box. Inside were dozens of letters, not sorted, but each carefully folded. Jake opened one at random, woman's handwriting, shaky but full of gratitude. "Jack, thank you for fixing my husband's bike after last year's storm. We had no money to pay you, but you helped anyway. Without you, we never would have gotten our kid to the hospital in time." Another in a child's scrawl. "Uncle Jack, thank you for building me that bicycle. I promise I'll study hard so I can grow up and be a builder like you." Another bore an army postmark. "Mr. Jack, I don't know who you are. Only that a silver-haired man patched our Jeep in the middle of a snowy night. You saved the whole platoon." Jake set the stack down, hands still trembling. These weren't thank yous for an ordinary mechanic. They were proof of a life spent helping others, of a man whose heart was bigger than anything he ever showed the world, of a good biker, a true legend. Jake understood clearly now. Jack didn't just build bikes, he healed people. He walked deeper into the cellar, eyes scanning everything, afraid to miss even the smallest detail. And that's when he saw something that slowed his heartbeat. A large wooden chest pushed against the stone wall, almost completely hidden by old tarps and crates of broken parts. The chest was about 5 feet long, a little under 2 feet wide, made of thick oak darkened by time to the color of coffee grounds. What caught his eye wasn't the size but the heavy iron lock right in the center, not some cabinet lock, but the kind you see on old pirate treasure. Big, solid, clearly meant to keep out grown men with bad intentions, not curious kids. Jake stepped closer and laid a hand on the lid. The wood was cold, rough, but rock solid, no rot, no cracks, meaning the owner had cared for it specially. He ran the light along the edges and saw tiny carvings running around the lid, not decoration. Symbols, biker symbols of the open road, of freedom, of brotherhood, and dead center on the lid, carved deep. RJ Jake drew a long breath. "Well now," he muttered. "Definitely not for ordinary stuff." Still, he didn't rush to open it, partly because the lock looked unbreakable, partly because he felt not yet allowed, not in some mystical way, but in the way one biker respects the weight of another's legacy. Whatever was inside that chest wasn't trivial. It meant something. It had been hidden, and it was waiting for someone worthy. He sat down beside it, back against the cold stone wall. The entire workshop surrounded him like an underground cathedral, where time had stopped but history still breathed. He looked up at the frames, the drawings, the letters, the photographs of an era he'd only ever heard about. And he saw himself, Jake Bear Lawson, small and huge at the same time. Small because he stood before a legend's legacy. Huge because maybe, just maybe, he'd been chosen to wake it up. The flashlight threw his shadow on the wall. A lone biker in the dark, surrounded by the remnants of a generous, passionate life. Jake placed his hand on the lid again. "Jack," he said softly, "I don't know what you left in here, but I'll find out. And I'll protect it like I'd protect my brothers." Up above, the barn stood silent, but down in the cellar a faint cold breeze passed through, like a nod from the old world. Jake smiled, eyes serious yet warm. Jake sat for a long time in front of that wooden chest, as if the silence of the basement was testing him one more time. But when his hand ran along the edge of the wood and touched the heavy iron lock, he knew without doubt that the moment had come, the exact same feeling he'd had when he knew he had to open the trap door. A legacy never tells its own story. It demands that the seeker have enough patience, enough respect, and enough courage. Jake pulled out the bolt cutters, slid the steel jaws over the shackle, took a deep breath, and snapped it shut. The sharp crack of breaking metal echoed through the basement, not harsh, not cold, but like the relieved sigh of a soul finally freed after decades of being locked away. The lid of the chest trembled slightly, as if it opened itself a fraction before he even touched it. Jake lifted the lid with both hands, slowly, carefully, the way someone opens the first sacred book of their life. The flashlight beam fell inside, and Jake held his breath. Not gold or silver, not weapons, not valuable machinery. A journal, thick enough that its spine was curved, leather cover cracked with age, the smell of old paper mixed with engine oil, the smell of a biker's life. Jake lifted the journal with both hands, as though it weighed more in memories than in paper. When he opened the first page, the handwriting appeared clear, strong, straightforward. "If anyone is reading these words, it means I'm no longer here to explain the truth. So I leave it here in the only place that ever understood me. Redwood Jack, 1968. Jake's heart missed a beat. He turned to the second page, then the third, and the words made the whole basement seem to warm little by little. Jack began telling about his early years on the road, storms that knocked down half the highway, bikes that died in the middle of the desert, long nights carrying wounded soldiers from distant towns to the nearest hospital. Times he used his own motorcycle as a shield to stop a runaway truck and save a stranger's family. Jake read slowly, every word soaked straight into him. "I've got no special talent. I just can't stand by and watch someone else suffer and walk away. Maybe that's the biggest weakness of my life, but it's also the only thing that ever made me feel I lived right." Jake gave a small, painful but understanding smile. Bikers are usually seen as rebels, troublemakers, outlaws. But among the long-haul miles, among the roar of engines, there have always been hearts that quietly trying to help people. He kept turning pages. Another entry told how Jack saved a group of young soldiers coming home from the war. Their truck broke down in a blizzard. No radio, no heat. Jack stopped, fixed their truck, then rode ahead for nearly 40 miles, lighting fires to guide them, giving them his own clothes. When they offered money, he just laughed. "You boys pay me by getting home safe." Jake felt his eyes sting. He thought of Bowen, his brother who once carried a lost kid 60 miles to get him back to town, who used his own leather jacket to cover a shivering dog in the rain. People like Jack, like Bowen, they weren't the kind of heroes who get statues. They lived on in the quiet stories. Bikers told one another, and now they lived again on the pages in his hands. He turned another page. One entry started. "Some folks say I harbor bad kids. But if it wasn't for me, who'd teach them to fix things instead of breaking them?" Jake let out a soft, choked laugh. Jack wrote about the teenagers kicked out of school, abandoned by their families. He taught them how to hold a wrench, how to change a spark plug, how to work until they were too tired to get into trouble. Some stayed with him for years, became good mechanics. Some became decent family men. Nobody ever knew. The world just saw a lonely, grumpy old man rumored to be dangerous. Jake closed his eyes for a few seconds, picturing the silver-haired man from the dream he'd had the night before. Turns out it wasn't a hallucination. It was Jack's memory finding a way to speak. He kept reading. The next pages grew heavier in tone. "They call me a troublemaker. They call me a reckless biker. They're not wrong. But they never see the people I pulled out of wrecks, the nights I stayed up teaching a kid to put down the knife and pick up a wrench. They don't know how many secrets I kept for people who never had to pay me back. The handwriting slanted a little, as if written by a hand shaking from exhaustion or emotion. Jake swallowed hard. In that moment he saw himself reflected in Jack, misunderstood, labeled dangerous, watched with suspicion, yet still choosing to be decent even when no one was looking. Then the journal's mood changed completely. Jack wrote about this very workshop, about why he built it underground, not to hide anything illegal, but because he wanted a quiet place to keep the blueprints, the parts, the stories of everyone he'd ever helped. He wrote, "I don't believe the world still listens to kindness anymore, but if someone ever finds this place, I hope it's someone who understands that goodness isn't for showing off, it's for keeping." Jake let the journal rest on his lap and drew a deep breath to push back the emotions swelling in his chest. He understood what Jack meant, understood it so deeply it hurt. Because he'd lived it, helped people and still been treated like a criminal, saved a girl from an abusive boyfriend, and been the first one the cops questioned. He used to think the world was unfair to good bikers, but now reading Jack's words, the weight felt lighter. At least he wasn't alone. He turned to the final pages, the writing sparser, shakier. Jack wrote, "I'm old now. I don't know when I'll go. I only ask one thing, whoever comes after me, don't use this place for profit. Use it to carry on what I couldn't finish." Jake read that line 3 times. Each time it carved deeper into his heart. What I couldn't finish. A message, a will, a baton passed to the next runner. Jake closed the journal with both hands and held it to his chest. He bowed his head, eyes shut. The air in the workshop seemed to stand still. No wind, no echoing metal, just his heartbeat joining the heartbeat of a soul long gone. Jack whispered, voice hoarse, "I get it now." He opened his eyes and looked around. The unfinished frame, the blueprints, the thank you letters, the photographs of a golden age. None of it was meant for a museum. All of it existed to be continued. Jake let out a long breath, but it was the breath of a man who had finally found his true direction after years of being lost. Jake stood up, the journal still warm in his hands as if it carried the breath of an old mechanic who refused to leave the world, and as he walked back to Redwood Jack's unfinished bike, he felt a clear, invisible push. It was time for the barn to live again. Not for show, not for profit, but to carry Jack's soul forward. In the days that followed, Jake poured every hour, every ounce of strength, and all his heart into bringing the workshop back to life. He replaced the rotten floorboards above, reinforced the barn's beams with new steel, cleaned every corner of the basement. The flashlight was replaced by a small lighting system powered by a generator he installed himself, turning the once dark space into a warm underground shop glowing with metal and welding sparks. The clink of wrenches, the whine of drills, the footsteps of one lone man working without rest filled the days like the heartbeat of a barn being reborn. When Jake finally mounted the first frame section according to Jack's blueprints, he placed his hand on the still hot steel and felt a faint vibration, as if someone's spirit was working beside him. He whispered, "Jack, am I doing this right?" And the way the light danced across the metal made him believe the answer was yes. The barn above ground, once just a crumbling shell, began to change too. The people of Butte, who used to avoid him, now watched from a distance. Some were curious, some worried, some thought he was turning the old shed into a biker clubhouse, but no one guessed the truth. Beneath their feet, a legend's legacy was rising again. Yet the changes didn't attract only friendly eyes. While raising new supports, Jake noticed strange footprints around the barn, large boots that circled the foundation and disappeared toward the mountain trail. At first he thought hunters or lost kids, but when the same prints appeared 3 days in a row, he knew someone was watching, and not casually. Those footprints lingered longest behind the barn, directly above the trap door. Jake tightened his cap, tension rising like a drawn wire. He'd lived long enough to know when a big secret surfaces, trouble wakes up too. He kept working, but his ears stayed tuned to every sound outside. The first night he slept in the barn to keep watch. Wind whistling through the roof gaps sounded like someone whispering. He told himself it was imagination, but a road-hardened biker's instincts told him clear. Someone was stalking. The arrival of a black pickup confirmed it. One afternoon while Jake was cutting steel, an unfamiliar engine growled in the distance. He killed the welder and listened. Not a civilian car, not a miner's truck. It was the low, heavy thud of a tuned diesel. Jake peered through a gap in the barn door. Late sunlight glinted off a black truck with no plates parked on the ridge about 100 yards away. 3 men got out, built big, moving with purpose, not biker style. One raised binoculars and stared straight at the barn. Jake stayed still, hand resting on a crowbar out of reflex, heart steady but pounding. The man with the binoculars spoke to the others, then all three climbed back in and drove off without coming closer. But Jake knew exactly what that meant. They didn't need to come closer to size up value. They just needed to know the place was worth coming back for. That night, Jake sat beside the unfinished bike in the basement and opened Jack's journal again. A handwritten passage he'd only skimmed before now jumped out like a warning. There are people who don't care about the soul of a machine. They only care what it can be sold for. My blueprints, my bikes to them, they're just rare merchandise. That's why I hid this place. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want my legacy in the wrong hands. Jake sat frozen. Jack's words cut straight through the years to warn him. He remembered a notorious crew, the Blackhounds collectors, hunters of vintage motorcycles, but not the civilized kind. They break in, bribe, or threaten to seize rare machines and flip them overseas for huge money. If they'd caught wind of the barn or seen Jake restoring too many bikes, they would definitely return. And not to talk politely, Jake sped up the restoration. He worked himself to exhaustion every day, but never stopped. He reinforced the barn doors with new steel, added double locks, rigged simple alarms from cans and fishing line, crude but effective. He buried steel plates in the yard that would clank if stepped on, only he knew where. Jake wasn't a violent man, but he knew how to be ready. The road had taught him kindness doesn't mean weakness. One morning, before the sun cleared the ridge, Jake stepped outside and felt his spine go cold. Fresh boot prints pressed deep into the soft dirt right in front of the barn door, facing straight in, standing there a long time, then turning away. No attempt to hide them, blatant. As if someone wanted to say, "I know what you're doing." Jake crouched to study them. A second set was wider, longer stride, someone tall and heavy, and a third, smaller but placed higher, meaning the person stood on something to peer through the roof gap. They were surveying the barn, checking entrances, looking for weak spots. Jake clenched his fists, not for his own safety, but for the legacy under the floorboards. He straightened and scanned the Butte Valley. Wind whipped dust into streaks. The sky hung gray like a warning. Jake said aloud, "You kept this place hidden for half a century. Now it's my turn." From that day on, Jake worked, watched, and planned. He knew he couldn't count on the police. He was a biker, and prejudice against Hell's Angels meant people rarely believed him. But he wasn't alone in this life. He just had to ring the right bell at the right time. Down in the basement, Redwood Jack's workshop glowed brighter with steel and hope. Above ground, danger crept closer, one step at a time. The barn was coming back to life, and at the same moment, trouble from the outside world was waking up too. But Jake wasn't afraid. On the contrary, his blood ran hot, the way it did before a long night ride. For the first time in years, the road ahead was crystal clear. A biker lives right when he protects the people who matter to him, even if that person left the world long ago, and Jake Lawson would not let anyone touch Redwood Jack's legacy. Not while he still stood on this ground, not while his heart still beat, not when the wheel of fate had rolled to the exact moment it chose him to continue the story. The legacy was rising again, and danger had already begun, but Jake smiled.
He had faced bigger storms than this.
The road ahead, even full of shadows, was still the road of a decent biker, and he was not afraid of the dark. The dark was afraid of men like him. The wind shifted that afternoon, a cold blast sweeping across the Butte Valley, like nature's own warning to anyone willing to listen. Jake stood in front of the barn, arms folded across his chest, watching black clouds pile up on the horizon like predators circling prey. Montana weather was always unpredictable, but this felt different. The storm coming wasn't just from the sky. It was rolling in on tires, driven by human greed, carried on the boots of men who wanted what didn't belong to them. Jake did one last walk around the barn. The cracks in the old beams stood out sharper as the wind screamed. He laid a hand on a shaking support post. It needed reinforcing, but there was no time left. When he looked down the dirt road that led into the valley, instinct told him the Blackhounds were done watching. They were about to move. One man wasn't enough, and Jake knew exactly who to call. On the small wooden table, he picked up the old flip phone and scrolled to a name he hadn't touched in over 2 years. Mason Hawk Turner, the brother who'd once ridden beside him on California freeways. The man who'd carried him out of a bar fight. Everyone thought Jake was too deep in to survive. The one who'd walked away from the club before Jake did, tired of the violence, now living a quiet life on the edge of Idaho. The only person Jake trusted completely. He took a deep breath and hit call. It rang 3 times. Mason's voice came through, low and sharp as a blade cutting wind. "Bear, been a long damn time. What's wrong?" "I need you in Butte," Jake said. Voice steady but heavy. "Somebody's coming for something I have to protect. A legacy." 1 heartbeat of silence on the line. Then Mason, "Where are you exactly?" "Montana." "How long before they get there?" Jake glanced at the sky darkening faster than it should. "Sooner than I'd like." Mason exhaled hard, like he'd just made a life-changing decision. "Bear, keep that barn standing till I get there. I'm riding straight through the night." Jake didn't say thank you. In their world, some things didn't need saying. "You just kept your word." He ended the call as a gust slammed a loose sheet of metal against the wall with a howl like an animal. Jake stepped back inside, pulled the doors shut with a bang, ready for war. He checked every corner down in the basement. The dim yellow lights glowed off redwood Jack's frame. Up top he'd laid out makeshift traps, wire, steel plates, heavy boards. The barn wasn't just a building anymore. It was his ark in the coming flood, and the flood was almost here. The first raindrops fell, heavy, scattered, then thick and fast as if someone had ripped the sky open. They hammered the rusted tin roof like war drums, and through that curtain of water, Jake heard another sound. Engines. Not Harleys, not civilian cars. Cold, even soulless diesels, the kind men use when they want to do dirt and stay quiet in the dark. Jake killed every light on the ground floor, leaving only the glow from the basement. The barn sank into storm gray shadow, an old warrior hiding before the final charge. The engine stopped a few hundred yards out. Then more. 3, 4, 6. They were forming up. Jake pressed against the door, listening. 5 voices. Metal clinking. Guns or crowbars, he couldn't tell. One said, "Wait till the rain lets up, then we go in. Merch that rare won't wait forever." Another laughed. "That old biker thinks hiding out in Montana keeps him safe." Jake closed his eyes for 1 second. His worst fear was here tonight. The Blackhounds weren't just scouting anymore. They were hitting the barn tonight. He ran downstairs one last time, looked at the workshop lit like an ancient forge, looked at Jack's unfinished bike, looked at the journal, and felt the one thing he couldn't allow: failure. The rain turned brutal, pounding the roof like sledgehammers. The barn groaned. A main beam cracked with a sharp pop, the sound of an old arm finally giving out. "Not now," Jake ordered, as if the building were a fellow soldier. He raced back up, lashed extra rope around the weakest post. Wind nearly knocked him over, but he held on. He had to buy time, just until Mason arrived, before the barn or everything beneath it turned to ash. Footsteps splashing through gravel. Shouts, "He's in there. Get ready to breach." Jake pressed his back to the wall in the dark. He didn't like violence, but he wasn't afraid of it. The only thing that scared him was evil hands, taking something good. Rain made everything slick and deadly, but it also hid movement. Lightning flashed, lighting up a face. Another blackhound with a fighting knife, eyes wild as a night predator. He didn't charge Jake or Mason. He went straight for the barn door. "No," Jake roared, charging through the downpour like a bullet. But right as the guy reached the threshold, a loud crack exploded from the roof, the sound Jake had dreaded for days. A main beam, battered loose by the storm, tore free and crashed down, slamming into the mud just yards away. The whole barn shuddered like a dying beast. The blackhound froze for 1 heartbeat, just long enough for Jake to catch him, shoulder check him face first into the mud. They wrestled in the flood, mud flying. But the guy recovered faster than Jake expected. He spun, knife flashing, slicing a long, shallow cut across Jake's jacket, madness in his eyes. Not hate, greed. "You don't even know what's down there," he screamed over the thunder. "We do," Jake growled through clenched teeth, locking the man's arm. "I know it better than all you bastards put together." 1 hard headbutt and the guy went over backward. Mason dropped his own opponent and hauled Jake up. "Bear, the barn's not gonna hold much longer," Mason yelled over the gale. Jake looked. Mason was right. Every gust tilted the whole structure farther. Sheets of tin ripped off and sailed like blades. The ground under the mud trembled. Worst of all, the trapdoor was still open. Rain was pouring downstairs. Jack's blueprints, frames, journal. Everything could be ruined in minutes. One thought burned clear. Save what he could. "Hawk, I'm going below," Jake shouted. Mason stared at him like he was insane. "Now, the place is coming down. Bear, you are not dying in there. I'm not letting Jack's legacy die." Jake shot back and bolted inside without waiting. Inside the barn was pitch black, a hungry mouth. The roof shook violently. Walls leaned. Sawdust fell like a second rain. Jake slid across the wet floor, dove for the basement steps, leaping two at a time, while the storm outside and the barn's death rattle inside merged into one roar. Hold on just a little longer. Please hold on. He hit the basement floor sliding. Rainwater ran in rivulets down the walls, but the lights he'd wired still glowed. Everything Jack left behind trembled in that light. Jake stuffed the journal inside his jacket, rolled the blueprints into tight bundles, tied them with rope, crammed thank you letters, photos, critical tools into canvas bags. A massive boom overhead. Dust poured like gray snow. He didn't have to look. Another section of roof gone. He heard Mason screaming something topside, but the storm swallowed it. Jake clutched both bags to his chest and started up the stairs, when a huge section of ceiling tore loose and crashed down, blocking the stairwell completely. A beam the size of a tree trunk slammed across the steps inches from his boots. Trapped, Jake sucked in air, forced calm. He set the bags down, threw his shoulder against the beam. It moved maybe an inch, while his muscles screamed. He tried again, veins bulging, when a sharp crack behind him froze his blood. A main support pillar snapped. The barn was collapsing in on itself. The floor shook. Dust blinded him. A deep animal roar from the roof. The beast falling. Bear, get out now. Mason's voice raw. Jake glanced back at Jack's things trembling at his feet, then at the blocked exit. In that instant he understood how Jack must have felt all those years, choosing to help and being misunderstood for it. Kindness always costs something. Jake crouched, hugged every last piece to his chest. I ain't leaving you, Jack. He spun, looking for any way out, and in the worst second of despair, he spotted a section of wall rotted by decades of seepage, cracked just enough. He lowered his shoulder and charged. First hit, wider crack. Second, stone crumbled. Third, the whole section blew out, opening a narrow escape to the back side of the barn. He squeezed through sideways as wind screamed, dragging the bags behind him. The instant he cleared the hole, the ground bucked like an earthquake. Mason was there, yanking him clear. Move! They sprinted dozens of yards before the barn gave its final death cry. One long explosive crack as its soul let go. The roof collapsed first, dragging frame, beams, walls down in a roar. A massive pillar slammed exactly where Jake had stood seconds earlier. The floor caved. Dust billowed into a gray cloud inside the rain. The barn, Jack's home, keeper of memories, workshop, heart of an era, was gone. The black hounds stood at a distance, screaming in rage at the wreckage. One yelled, "The stash was down there. You destroyed it." Jake stood panting in the downpour, clutching the two precious bags to his chest, blood running from his arm and forehead, but his eyes burned like fire. "No," he said, voice low and steady as an idling engine. "The legacy's right here." Mason stood beside him, chain in hand, stance unbreakable as granite. "And you assholes," Mason added through the rain, "won't touch so much as one bolt of it." One final lightning strike lit the scene. Two bikers standing tall in the storm, backs straight, arms full of the saved legacy, while behind them the barn lay down like an old warrior who'd sacrificed himself to protect his secret. The storm kept pouring, but something strange filled Jake's chest, not grief for a lost place, but relief. The barn had chosen its own ending, and he had saved its heart. Through the pounding rain and howling wind, he thought he heard a hoarse, warm voice on the air. "Good job, kid." Jake wasn't sure if it was the wind or Jack, but he smiled, because deep down he knew the legacy was safe. The storm finally broke at dawn, leaving the Butte sky pale as fresh paper, while the ground still trembled faintly under the wet mud. Jake stood there, exhausted but still clutching the two bags holding Jack's legacy, feeling his heavy breaths blend into the cold Montana air. Mason laid a hand on his shoulder, saying nothing, because sometimes victory doesn't need cheers, just the knowledge that you've held on to what's most important. As sunrise came, the first light touched the barn's wreckage, turning the broken beams into sad golden streaks. The barn was gone. But Jake knew its value wasn't in the walls, roof, or dirt. The value was in what he'd clutched with his life. Of the pursuers from last night, some had fled into the storm, others knocked down by Mason and held long enough by the mud to force a retreat. Bowie was strangely quiet, as if the whole town was holding its breath for what came next, and it came just hours later. As the sun rose high enough to dry the first puddles, the guiding sound of the biker world echoed from afar. Engines. Not one, not 10, but dozens of deep, heavy rumbles, like a second thunder rolling into the valley. Jake looked up. Mason turned toward the dirt road. Black dots appeared on the horizon and grew, until he could make out the long line of Harleys, Indians, and Triumphs, stretching endlessly, leather jackets, patches from dozens of chapters, long beards, tattoos, three-quarter helmets, and leading the pack, the Hells Angels Boise chapter flag whipping in the wind. Jake froze. "Jesus, Bear," Mason whispered. "Who the hell did you call?" "I didn't call anyone," Jake replied, voice low. "They came on their own." When the convoy stopped on the property, the ground shook lightly like the night the barn fell. Over 100 bikers dismounted. No one spoke. No one caused trouble. No one showed off. They just stood there looking at Jake, at the rubble, at the bags of legacy in his arms. The leader was Ray Bulldog Harper, president of the Boise chapter, the man who'd once seen Jake as a little brother but hadn't interfered when Jake left the club too broken after Bowen's death. Ray stepped forward, his beard damp with dew, eyes stern but warm. "Jake bears Lawson," he said. "We heard you went crazy and let some barn collapse in a storm." A few bikers behind chuckled softly. Ray took another step. "But we heard something more important, that you saved Redwood Jack's legacy." Jake stayed silent. Ray eyed him head to toe, then the canvas bags against his chest. "Jake tuned bikes for our chapter back when we were too broke for a new spark plug," Ray said, voice dropping low. "He never took a dime." The air went still for seconds. Then Ray laid a heavy warm hand on Jake's shoulder. "So today we're not here to look at a fallen barn," he squeezed like a vow. "We're here to make sure no one, not even the Black Hounds, touches a damn thing he left behind." A lone engine growled from the distance. Heads turned. Two bikers from other chapters, Seattle and Billings, had just arrived. Then more groups rolled in from Idaho, Wyoming, Washington. They'd heard about the barn collapse. They'd heard someone was after Jack's legacy. And as word spread in the biker world, no orders needed. No one called a meeting, they just showed up, out of respect for Jack, and because Jake Lawson's name was echoing in the community as the one carrying on something decent. Plenty of Butte folks watched from afar, faces confused and curious. An old woman even covered her mouth. They're not here to wreck things, are they? But then they saw a sight that silenced the town. Over 100 bikers formed a ring around the rubble like steel sentinels, quietly guarding what had been Jack's workshop. No yelling, no noise, no flexing. Just standing calm in the wind, like soldiers watching an ancient temple. And for the first time, Butte saw what Jake had always known. Bikers could be scary, but decent bikers never left each other hanging. Jake stepped onto a large beam from the fallen barn, facing all the eyes on him. "Thanks," he said, voice hoarse, but clear. "I saved the journal. The blueprint's part of Jack's workshop. But the barn's gone." Ray shook his head. "The barn can go. The legacy doesn't." From the back, another biker called, "Jack saved a lot of us. Today we're paying a little back." Another added, "If it needs rebuilding, we build it. If it needs protecting, we protect it." The morning wind gusted, snapping the Boise chapter flag harder. A few town kids ran to their moms, asking why are they helping him. The mom looked at Jake, then at the hundreds of bikers standing like a steel wall. "Because he's good," she whispered. "And good people always find each other." Jake overheard. Something heavy in his chest, carried for years, suddenly lifted. He wasn't the lone misunderstood biker anymore. He wasn't protecting Jack's legacy alone. He had brothers, he had community, and he had a town starting to see the truth. Guys in leather on Harleys weren't always the bad ones. Sometimes, they were the last guardians of decency. As the sun climbed higher, and hundreds of bikers still stood in that silent protective circle, Jake looked at the barn's rubble, and knew last night wasn't an end, but a beginning. Ray stepped up, hand on his shoulder, voice firm. "There, we're rebuilding this place. Not a copy but a new shop, strong enough to take storms, big enough for Jack's dreams." Even Mason nodded, eyes sharp as forged iron. "And this time, no one gets close without going through us." Word spread fast the biker way. No commands, no meetings, but one engine rev, and dozens rolled up sleeves, ready to work. Reconstruction started the same day the barn fell. Bikers who'd been carpenters measured new foundations. Welders raised steel frames 10 times stronger than old wood. Electricians ran wires and installed lights bright enough to make the underground workshop pulse like a beating heart. But folks, who'd once stepped aside when Jake passed on his Harley, now brought coffee, warm water, even homemade pies. They watched over 100 bikers work focused, quiet, orderly, no complaints. Just the sounds of machines, hammers, steel clanging and calls to pass wood, hold frames, lift roofs. An old townie whispered, "I've lived 70 years, never seen bikers build, only heard they destroy." A grizzled biker nearby chuckled, "We can build too, just not many see it." Jake led a small group to the basement, now just a bare hole, but the important stuff saved. He opened the bags, spread Redwood Jack's blueprints on a makeshift table in the shade. The bikers around leaned in, eyeing those drawings with deep respect, like facing the chopper world's Bible. "We'll rebuild this workshop," Jake said, voice low but clear, "and Jack's last bike will finish it." A wave of silence swept the basement, not awkward, but the silence of men grasping the weight ahead. A young biker, no chapter patch yet, stepped up softly. "It'd be my honor to help." Jake laid a hand on his shoulder. "Everyone here helps. This legacy ain't mine alone." And so restoring the legendary chopper began. The frame got hoisted onto a shiny new stand. Rusted parts came off, cleaned, some replaced true to Jack's designs. Every metal curve, every weld done careful as stitching the past itself. Details Jack noted, push the rake 2 more degrees. Dampen the throttle vibe, tilt the seat back a hair, all followed by Jake and Mason to the line. Nothing missed. "Not for a pretty show bike," Jake said, to finish his last wish. When the engine got pieced together, an old-timer, who'd ridden with Jack young, laid a hand on the block like prayer. "Jack, see if we're doing right." The topside shop rose so fast. Butte folks stared in shock. Steel skeleton up in 2 days. Stormproof lightweight walls in 1 more. Wide doors designed to swing open for 3 choppers abreast. And at the barn's new heart, Jake insisted on space for Jack's bike. Not museum display, but reminder this shop was born from one simple man's kindness. 3 weeks later, with the rough shop done, rare Montana sun poured down. Jake, Mason, and dozens more ringed Jack's final chopper. Time to fire it up. Jake eased onto the seat, like afraid to wake Jack's ghost, then keyed it. Bikers went dead quiet. Wind stilled. Space froze in 10 seconds. Jake breathed slow, twisted the grip. The engine shuddered. Then, rumble, 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 the startup roared like thunder from underground. Powerful, deep, pure old-school chopper growl. Not machine noise, but a heart waking after half a century asleep. One biker teared up. Others laughed loud. Mason slapped Jake's shoulder hard. "Bear, you made him proud." Jake didn't answer. He laid a hand on the tank. Eyes closed seconds, feeling the vibe, and he swore he heard Jack chuckle soft in the wind. The new workshop finished a week later. Over the main door a metal plaque read, "Redwood Jack Memorial Garage. Keep the road kind." And under it Jack's last chopper sat proud, not like a mummified past, but symbol of a soul still alive. From the day the new workshop opened, Jake's life changed in ways he'd never imagined. Montana mornings, once quiet, now started with light metal clinks, oil smells, and laughs from young kids learning to grip a wrench for the first time. But folks who'd once sidestepped him on his Harley now knocked on the shop door with broken bikes, questions for help, or just to see the place, folks said got built from a biker's kindness. Jake was still Jake, quiet, few words, more doer than shower, but something in him got lighter, brighter, like his long-lost road finally found a stop. The shop ran non-profit. Jake fixed bikes free for vets, cut rates for workers, and he, Mason, and other bikers taught troublemaking town kids repair skills weekends. A boy once warned by school for fighting told Jake, "Bear, I think I want to be like you. I want to fix bikes to help folks." Jake just patted his shoulder, but inside those words meant more than any cash. Tourists from nearby states started dropping by, not for pics of a ruined barn, but to see Redwood Jack's chopper, the bike now shop heart. Each visitor asked, was Jack really that decent? And Jake, once no storyteller, became keeper of a tale bigger than himself. He told of Jack, the old loner, who helped without payback. Goodness never noted, how he built the underground shop not to hide wealth but keep his life's best part. He told of the fallen barn, how it sheltered the legacy to the end, and that stormy night when he and Mason stood in rain guarding what mattered. Not everyone grasped it all, but they felt the truth. A biker's kindness ain't legend. It's real, written in greasy hands, scars, sacrificing hearts. Slowly, Bud saw bikers different. When Harleys rolled in, kids didn't hide behind adults but ran out waving. Old-timers on porches didn't scowl but nodded hello. And when Jake passed, Folks stopped calling him that strange biker. They called him Jack's legacy keeper. One summer afternoon, as Jake stood on the shop porch watching sun hit Jack's chopper, Mason came up with a cold soda. "You did it, Bear," Mason said, eyes distant. "You kept that old promise." Jake paused, then asked, "Hawk, you ever think I'd pull it off?" Mason smirked. "I didn't think. I knew." Simple words, but they silenced Jake. He remembered old days, long runs with Bowen, nights in lots, tired mornings, climbing saddles because biker life don't allow stops. He remembered losses that tore him up. And now, before the lit shop, he got that every road led here, not to flee past but finish something for the future. As sun dipped behind distant mountains, Jake stepped back inside. Golden light fell on Jack's blueprints wall hung, the legendary bike gleaming like living steel heart, young faces wrapped learning hands-on work. Jake stood amid it, warmth spreading in his chest. And right then, he named what he dodged all along. He didn't just buy a rundown shed. He didn't just find a buried workshop. He didn't just save a legend's legacy. He was chosen to carry what Redwood Jack started, chosen to teach kindness by deeds, not words. Chosen to tell the story the world overlooked. Jake Bear, Lawson looked around the shop, then whispered, not sure to Mason, the workshop or Jack. "I'm here, and I'll keep this fire till the road ends." In the workshop's quiet light wind brushed through, gentle as an old soul's nod to his successor. And so Jake's fate changed, not by magic, but the goodness he chose to hold. Jack's legacy lived on, and Jake became part of it. If you enjoyed this story, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next emotional journeys. See you in the next part, where stories of kindness and biker spirit keep living forever.